Welcome to the sixth lecture in our Roosevelt-Reagan series. In our last lecture, we noted the difficulties President Roosevelt had with Congress in the 2 years after his landslide re-election in 1936. A heavily Democratic Senate refused to go along with his attempt to take over the Supreme Court by appointing 6 additional justices. Roosevelt was also unable, in a series of primaries he involved himself in, to purge the party of several senators and congressmen who were insufficiently cooperative with his agenda by opposing the court packing and otherwise. A conservative coalition arose in Congress through which many of its Southern Democratic members now directly allied themselves with the Republicans. Congress, it seemed, would not be passing further New Deal legislation. Then, in 1939 through 1941, the president had to fight a series of battles over the possibility of American involvement in what would soon become the Second World War. Most Republicans opposed him in these battles, siding with the anti-interventionist or so-called isolationist viewpoint. The Southern Democrats, however, generally supported Roosevelt despite their now very considerable opposition to him in domestic policy. In this, the sixth lecture in the Alexander Hamilton Institute series on the Roosevelt and Reagan presidencies, we will examine the political struggle between the interventionists and the anti-interventionists, which ranks among the most important controversies of the 20th century and whose outcome decisively shaped that century. A strongly pro-Roosevelt historian, Arthur Schlesinger, would note more than 50 years later that scholars had paid too little attention to the extreme divisiveness of this struggle. Though historians have dealt with the policy issues, he wrote, justice has not been done to the searing personal impact of those angry days. As General Marshall remarked, people have forgotten the great hostility of that time. An important backdrop to the isolation-intervention debate was our country's experience in the First World War and immediately thereafter. As I noted in our first lecture, Roosevelt had supported American membership in the League of Nations, created by the peace treaty after World War I. The new organization, which we now look back on as a forerunner of the United Nations, grew out of President Woodrow Wilson's vision of that conflict as a war to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy. Although most senators at the time supported American membership in the League of Nations, the Senate failed to ratify such membership because this support fell short of 2/3. Those who opposed American membership, however, voiced different degrees of opposition. A few senators simply wanted no involvement in the League, but many others wanted or were willing to agree to American membership on less demanding terms that would, in their view, pose less danger of reducing American sovereignty and of dragging the United States into a war on behalf of other nations' interests, or for vaguely defined international ideals. But many others wanted or were willing to agree to American membership on less demanding terms that would, in their view, pose less danger of reducing American sovereignty and of dragging the United States into another war on behalf of other nations' interests, or for vaguely defined international ideals. Roosevelt was a member of the Wilson administration as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but although he favored our joining the League of Nations, he believed Wilson should compromise with Senate Republicans on the specifics of U.S. membership in order to get it approved, and this the stubborn president famously refused to do. Thus began almost 2 decades of what would be seen in retrospect as American isolation from Europe. Roosevelt's pragmatism and sensitivity to public opinion were clear in the decade leading up to the Second World War, as he reluctantly supported the neutrality legislation that was passed by Congress in order to prevent America from getting into another overseas conflict. By forbidding the United States to provide weapons to either side in a war, the Neutrality Act stood in the way of American involvement until its partial repeal in September of 1939. The partial appeal allowed the U.S. to sell arms to nations at war, but the anti-interventionists were able to keep a ban on carrying such supplies into a war zone by American ships. There were several reasons why anti-interventionist and neutralist sentiment was so strong in Congress. One was the conviction that involvement in foreign wars was not in America's national interest. Another was the belief that European nations, and especially Britain, wanted to get Americans to do their fighting for them when no U.S. national interest was at stake. There was also a belief that international communism and the Soviet Union were a greater danger to Western civilization and the U.S. than was Nazism. And finally, the anti-interventionists feared that entry into a major war, at least under President Roosevelt, would create a dictatorship in America. This last charge was credible enough to many Republicans in Congress and elsewhere, given the sometimes manipulative and even authoritarian approach that President Roosevelt had taken to domestic issues. The context of the interventionist anti-interventionist debate was heightened aggression by the nations America would eventually be at war with, Japan starting with its occupation of northeastern China in 1931, and Germany starting a few years after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, with its growing violations of the post-World War I settlement of Europe's geopolitical landscape. Americans were never sympathetic to Germany's and Japan's power grabs in the 1930s, but they strongly preferred to keep out of harm's way. Roosevelt, in contrast, had viewed such issues differently all along, telling Henry Stimson, the outgoing Secretary of State, shortly before his inauguration as president in 1933, that he agreed with the Stimson Doctrine, which had been articulated during the Hoover administration, whereby the U.S. would refuse to recognize border changes resulting from invasions. In 1937, the president made clear his concerns about German and Japanese aggression by giving a speech in Chicago in which he seemed to urge action against it. Although he refused to clarify his somewhat vague remarks when speaking afterward with journalists, Roosevelt had said, "When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. War is a contagion. The peace of the world is today being threatened. We are determined to keep out of war, yet we cannot insure ourselves against the disastrous effects of war and the dangers of involvement." End quote. Newspaper editorials' reactions to the speech were mixed, and a large majority of the mail to the White House supported the president's remarks, but there was a loud opposing outcry in Congress. Two private comments from Roosevelt at the time reflect the pressures and frustrations he was under. "It's a terrible thing," he said to one of his speechwriters, Sam Rosenman, "to look over your shoulder when you're trying to lead, and to find no one there." And as the president wrote his former prep school headmaster at Groton, the Reverend Endicott Peabody, "I'm fighting against a public psychology of long standing, a psychology which comes very close to saying, peace at any price." It's important to note that many of the leading anti-interventionists in Congress had been liberal Republicans. They had supported much or most of the New Deal legislation, but for a variety of reasons were determined to keep America out of what they regarded as other countries' problems. Republican progressives in the Senate, such as William Borah, Hiram Johnson, and Gerald Nye, worked with independent progressives like Robert La Follette Jr. and a prominent liberal Democrat, Burton K. Wheeler, to oppose Roosevelt's steps toward intervention in the European situation. The cautiously interventionist president, having succeeded in partial repeal of the Neutrality Act, took another major step in the latter half of 1940, when Britain was barely hanging on against the German onslaught. The president decided to give Britain 50 overage destroyers in return for long-term rights to several of its bases in the Western Hemisphere, mainly the Caribbean. He'd been reluctant to do so, however, until he got assurance from his opponent for re-election in 1940, Republican candidate Wendell Willkie, that Willkie would not oppose it. Also got Congress to approve the first peacetime draft in American history. In terms of public opinion, the anti-interventionists seem to have lost their struggle in mid and late 1940, when polls indicated a shift from greater concern for keeping out of the war to greater concern for preventing a complete German victory in Europe. That didn't mean the American people were now willing to run the kinds of risks that Roosevelt would later engage in, risks which can fairly be said to have gradually gotten America into an undeclared naval war with Germany over the course of 1941. But it did mean they were willing to support not just preparations for a possible war, such as the draft, but also a major program of aid to Britain, the Lend-Lease Bill, which passed Congress by a wide margin in early 1941, despite an intensive campaign against it by the America First Committee. The measure, which was Roosevelt's own idea, was prompted by what was now Britain's virtual bankruptcy, its inability to pay for such weapons as the partial repeal of the Neutrality Act had allowed it to buy from the United States on a cash-and-carry basis. Cash-and-carry meant pay for it now and take it across the ocean on your own ships. In addition, more than 500 British merchant ships had been sunk by the German naval forces. At a meeting in early December of 1940, high-level officials and the Army Chief of Staff, General Marshall, met with Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, whose officials drew Britain's grim financial figures on a blackboard. It seemed the country's ability to pay for American materiel would run out within a month. "What are we going to do?" Morgenthau asked. The response by Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox was perhaps one of the defining moments, not only of the interventionist-anti-interventionist debate, but of the entire American century, the period beginning around 1940, in which America took center stage in world affairs and significant responsibility for the world's future, often at great expense. "Are we going to let them place more orders?" Morgenthau asked. "Got to," Knox said. "No choice about it." Within 2 weeks, the president had come up with the idea of Lend-Lease, whose basic concept was that the U.S. would lend Britain any war items it needed, and that Britain would repay this by giving back the equipment or otherwise making up for it whenever that might be possible. In a remarks to the press, Roosevelt likened his concept to lending a hose to a neighbor whose house caught fire. "I don't want the $15 the item may have cost," the president explained. "I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." "What I'm trying to do," he added, "is eliminate the dollar sign. Get rid of the silly, foolish old dollar sign." The British would simply have what he called a gentleman's obligation to repay in some way. Lend-Lease authorized the president to, quote, "sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of," end quote, any item of military or naval use to, quote, "the government of any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States." While the destroyers for bases deal the previous year signified a small or medium-sized example of the age short of war policy, as it was sometimes called, which both Roosevelt and his re-election opponent Willkie favored, Lend-Lease began a much larger and, from an anti-interventionist standpoint, more dangerous kind of American involvement. In support of his proposal and of further intervention, the president on December 29, 1940, delivered what would be known as his Arsenal of Democracy address. "If Britain goes down," he warned, "the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australasia, and the high seas, and they will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. We well know that we cannot escape danger, or the fear of danger, by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads." Roosevelt insisted that partial involvement in the war was the best way for the U.S. to avoid actually going to war. "The people of Europe who are defending themselves," he said, "do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns which will enable them to fight for their liberty and for our security. Emphatically, we must get these weapons to them in sufficient volume and quickly enough so that we and our children will be saved the agony and suffering of war. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war." Objections to Lend-Lease centered on the argument that it was essentially a blank check for the president. Senator Nye claimed it would allow Roosevelt to, quote, "give away the United States Navy, to give to foreign governments all our military plans, to send naval convoys into war zones, to make America pay the costs of another country's war, and to ignore or repeal any existing law, quote, which the president considers interferes with his conduct of national defense." These, Nye said, were the powers of a dictator, and the Lend-Lease Act would, in effect, give the president, quote, the power to take this country into war. As he told the Senate, what I object to most strenuously is the surrender of constitutional powers by the Congress to the president. I am now more alarmed by the encroachments upon our constitutional status and the impairment of the regular processes of our government by the forces within the government itself than about possible aggressions against us by potential, but not necessarily probable, foreign foes. End quote. Another anti-interventionist, Senator Robert Taft, proposed amendments that would limit the president's authority and reduce the danger that Lend-Lease might lead to war, some of which the administration agreed to. The day after passage of the measure, in early March of 1941, Congress appropriated $7 billion for the first shipments to Britain under its terms. Roosevelt applauded the action by saying, "This decision is the end of any attempts at appeasement, the end of urging us to get along with dictators, the end of compromise with tyranny and the forces of oppression." This somewhat overstated language reflected the attitude of the president and many in his administration toward the anti-interventionists or isolationists, which we will discuss a bit in our next lecture. But considered more objectively, it can certainly be said that the passage of Lend-Lease and the prompt appropriation of major funds for Britain signified the decisive defeat of anti-interventionism on a policy level, since Congress had now given the president very extensive authority to provide military assistance to it, and indeed any other country he chose. If Germany tried to block such assistance on the high seas, America would have the difficult choice between giving up on much of that assistance and responding in ways likely to result in fuller combat. In the months after passage of Lend-Lease, it became increasingly clear that Roosevelt was willing to risk war in order to ensure maximum deliveries to America's new ally. In a fireside chat on May 27, 1941, he indicated that this shipping would proceed by any means necessary. "I say that this can be done, it must be done, and it will be done." Roosevelt also issued what he called a proclamation of unlimited national emergency. In our next lecture, we will discuss, in addition to the administration's treatment of the isolationists, the complex issues of American naval protection for British ships, the Atlantic Charter principles of international policy agreed to by Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill on Roosevelt's insistence in late 1941, and America's failed diplomacy with Japan in that same year. Thanks for listening.